The road through the forest stretched endlessly, lined with pine trees, whose shadows grew long in the late afternoon sun. David Miller's pickup hummed softly as it rolled over the cracked asphalt. It was supposed to be just another quiet drive home, a reprieve from the chaos that had defined so much of his life. After 2 tours in Afghanistan, silence and solitude were the only medicines that seemed to work. He liked the emptiness, the way the forest didn't ask questions or remind him of what he had lost. Night drives had become David's ritual since Sarah died 3 years ago. Cancer took her quickly, too quickly for Ethan to prepare, too quickly for David to figure out how to be both mother and father to their son. Mrs. Thompson from next door would watch Ethan while he drove a kindly woman in her 70s who understood grief well enough to know when a man needed space to breathe. The steering wheel felt rough beneath his calloused hands. Hands that once disarmed bombs and handled weapons now spent their days crafting furniture at Dawson's woodshop in town. The transition from Navy SEAL to carpenter hadn't been easy, but woodworking gave him something to shape, to control, when everything else felt beyond his grasp. A dark mass by the shoulder of the road made him ease his foot off the gas. At first glance, it looked like debris, a fallen branch, or maybe a deer carcass. But as his truck drew closer, the shape shifted ever so slightly, a faint twitch against the gray of the asphalt. David's instincts, those sharpened by years of scanning roadsides for threats, told him immediately this wasn't just roadkill. He slowed, pulled to the shoulder, and climbed out. The smell of pine and cold earth filled his lungs. His boots crunched gravel as he approached, and there it was, a German shepherd collapsed trembling. Its fur, once strong and striking, was now a tangled mess of black and gold, streaked with dirt and blood. Around its neck, a rusted chain had dug cruelly into the skin, leaving deep, raw marks. The dog's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. David knelt immediately, the soldier in him overtaking the civilian. He remembered nights in the desert when a comrade would go down, and seconds were the difference between life and death. His hands moved without hesitation, tearing strips from his undershirt, cleaning the wound with bottled water from his truck, pressing down firmly until the bleeding slowed. The shepherd whimpered but did not pull away. Its amber eyes flickered open, locking on him, with a gaze that seemed to plead not for survival, but for something more. "Easy, boy," David muttered, his voice steady though his chest ached. "You're not done yet. Not today." He wrapped the cloth around the flank, securing it tightly, then gently touched the matted fur around the neck wound. The chain's rust had stained the fur, and he could almost feel the years of cruelty pressed into that metal. David unclasped it and tossed it into the ditch with a sharp clank that echoed too loudly in the still woods. The sound felt like an ending. Minutes stretched, and David sat with the dog, listening to the faint rhythm of its breathing grow steadier. For a brief moment, he thought the worst was over. Then the shepherd stirred. Slowly, painfully, it pushed itself up on trembling legs, ignoring the pain etched in its body. David reached out to steady it, but the dog shook, growled softly, and then fixed its eyes on the narrow trail that branched off into the trees. Its entire body quivered with urgency. "Hey," David whispered, puzzled, "you need to rest." He tried to coax the dog back down, but the shepherd barked low, a guttural sound that carried insistence rather than aggression. Then it did something that startled him. It tugged at his jacket sleeve with its teeth. Weak but determined, the animal bit the fabric, pulled, and released only to repeat the motion. David froze, staring at the animal. "You're trying to tell me something." The words felt absurd leaving his mouth, but the intensity in the shepherd's eyes left no doubt. This wasn't random behavior. In Afghanistan, he'd worked with military dogs that communicated with similar purpose. They always had their reasons. Ranger, the name slipped into David's mind unbidden. A fighter, a survivor, a scout for what lay ahead. Against every ounce of reason, against the voice in his head, telling him to leave well enough alone. David rose to his feet. Ranger pressed on, dragging his wounded body onto the hidden trail, each step labored but purposeful. David glanced at his truck, then at the vast, darkening woods. The sky had begun to sink into hues of orange and violet, the kind of dusk that promised a hard night. "Damn it, Ranger. You win." He grabbed his pack from the truck, slung it over his shoulder, and followed. The emergency pack contained a flashlight, multi-tool first aid supplies, and the hunting rifle he kept secured in its case. Old habits from military life: always be prepared. The trail swallowed them whole. It wasn't wide, just a deer path etched into the earth, branches clawing at his jacket as they passed. David's boots cracked twigs underfoot, but Ranger moved with surprising precision despite his injuries. Occasionally the dog stumbled, but never stopped, always urging forward at ears, pinned back, eyes fixed on something only he seemed to know. As the trees closed in, David's heartbeat began to sync with the dog's determination. The soldier in him stirred again, that old awareness of moving towards something hidden, something dangerous. He didn't know what waited ahead, but Ranger's resolve made it clear whatever it was, it mattered. He tightened the straps of his pack, quickened his pace to match Ranger's, and let the forest swallow them both. The forest thickened the deeper they went, the trail bending into the kind of silence David remembered from patrols, when every footstep seemed to carry too loudly, when every sound might mask something else. He followed Ranger for nearly an hour, the dog moving with stubborn resolve, stopping only to steady himself before pressing on. David's breath misted in the growing cold, his legs reminding him of long marches under heavier packs. But something about the shepherd's determination kept him from calling a halt. The woods smelled of resin and damp earth. In the distance, an owl called once, then fell quiet as if retreating from whatever lay ahead. When the trail finally opened, David stopped dead. Before them stood an A-frame cabin tucked between tall pines. Its steep roofline cut a sharp triangle against the fading sky, dark wood walls peeling with age, streaks of moss clinging to the lower beams. The cabin looked abandoned, a forgotten piece of architecture left to surrender to the forest. Yet as David drew closer, his soldier's eyes caught details that spoke a different story. The front door was bound shut with a heavy iron chain, the padlock large and rusted, as though someone had locked it from the outside, not just to secure belongings, but to make absolutely certain nothing and no one could leave. The edges of the frame bore scratches, shallow but numerous, as if fingernails or tools had tried to work at it once and failed. David tightened his grip on the crowbar he had carried from the truck, the same one that had snapped a lock on his storage shed months ago. Ranger whined low in his throat, ears pinned, back body trembling, not from weakness this time, but from some recognition David could not yet understand. "Easy now," he whispered, though the words were more for himself. The chain resisted at first, groaning as he wedged the bar between links, but with leverage and a sharp twist, the old metal gave way in a sudden break that echoed across the clearing. The padlock dropped into the frost-bitten grass with a dull clank. The door eased open with a creak that sounded too loud a sound that reminded him of night entries in another life, when he had to push into rooms without knowing what waited inside. He stepped through. What lay beyond jarred him in an unexpected way. The interior did not match the neglect outside. A dining table sat under a hanging lamp, plates and cutlery still laid out. The faint warmth and smell of boiled potatoes still hung in the air. A kerosene lamp sat on a wooden shelf, its glass still warm, the wick a dull ember from a flame recently extinguished. And beside it, on a small end table, stood a glass of water with condensation still fogging its rim. David's throat tightened. Someone had been here very recently. The sense of absence was not that of a place long deserted, but of a room stepped away from only moments earlier. The air smelled faintly of oil and boiled potatoes, mingling with the woody scent of the pine logs that made up the walls. Ranger patted in beside him, sniffing the air with sharp jerks of his nose, tail low, every muscle poised. The shepherd moved toward the table, sniffed at the plates, then swung his head toward the far wall, ears flicking. David scanned the room the way he once scanned unfamiliar buildings, every corner, every doorway a potential threat. The cabin was larger inside than its triangular exterior suggested, with one central space and a loft above a narrow staircase climbing at a steep angle. A rug near the hearth bore footprints, faint but fresh, pressed into the fibers by boots not long gone. David knelt to study them, fingertips grazing the indentations, his pulse quickening as if he were back in combat, analyzing tracks that might tell him where an enemy had moved. They were heavy prints, likely a man's, leading from the door towards the kitchen counter and then disappearing into the shadows near the back hallway. The air was warmer than it should have been in an abandoned place, a lingering heat that suggested the fire had burned not long ago. He reached to touch the cast iron stove, finding it still faintly warm. Whoever had been here might still be close. He rose, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight, the sound carrying into the stillness. Ranger growled softly, positioning himself between David and the darkened hallway. David glanced around once more. The incongruity pressed on him, a house that looked condemned from the outside, yet inside told the story of an interrupted life, as if its occupant had simply stepped away, leaving everything mid-motion. He approached the glass of water, placed his finger against the rim. It was cool but not cold, still holding the warmth of breath or hand that had set it down. He inhaled, feeling the old unease coil in his gut, the same tension that had kept him alive when moments mattered most. Ranger's eyes met his, unblinking, sharp with meaning. There was no sign of a person, no footsteps leading out, no sound beyond the faint tick of cooling metal in the stove. Yet the silence pressed heavier, now more insistent, as though the cabin itself held its breath, waiting for what came next. The house's silence weighed on David like physical pressure, heavier with every breath. The dining table and still warm lamp had already unsettled him, but his instincts told him the surface only masked something deeper. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the walls, the wooden planks glowing pale in its circle of light. The air inside smelled of kerosene and cooked food, but beneath it lingered another note, faint but undeniable, metallic and sour. Ranger shifted restlessly, ears twitching, nose low to the ground, as though following a trail only he could sense. David followed the dog's movements, each step slow, and measured every board creaking under his weight like a warning. At the far end of the main room, he noticed a rug worn but out of place, its edges curled slightly upward. Ranger stopped there, pawing once, then looking back at David with eyes that gleamed in the flashlight's spill. David crouched, pressed his fingers into the rug's corner, and tugged. It rolled back easily, revealing a square hatch built into the floor, its edges darkened with age, but the hinges surprisingly well-oiled. His pulse quickened. He wrapped his hand around the iron ring and pulled. The hatch lifted with a faint groan, exhaling a rush of stale air from below. A wooden staircase descended into shadow. For a long moment, David stood there, the open dark at his feet, remembering countless times he had stepped into spaces, not knowing if they held safety or danger. He clicked the flashlight to high and started down, Ranger pressing close behind him. The air grew colder as they descended, damp and heavy, carrying the smell of concrete and earth. When the beam caught the basement walls, David froze. Across the pitted cement surface stretched a large map, hand-drawn in dark ink. He stepped closer, his breath fogging in the chill. The outlines were unmistakable, the forest surrounding them rendered in jagged lines and shaded blocks. But what seized him were the markings, dozens of red dots scattered across the map, almost all clustered near obscure trails and clearings. David leaned in, tracing them with his finger, and the realization cut deep. These places matched the reports he had heard in passing whispers in town about hikers gone missing, hunters who never returned. The memory of a bar conversation surfaced, names, rumors, a list that had always felt too long. Here in front of him was evidence that those disappearances were not accidents. His spine tightened with the familiar chill of battlefield clarity. He stepped back, scanning the rest of the basement. The concrete floor bore scratches, faint but deliberate, as if heavy objects had been dragged across it. A workbench leaned against one wall, scattered with tools too common to draw. Suspicion? Hammers, pliers, rope, but their arrangement felt purposeful, each lined up with precision. Ranger gave a low whine, pulling David's attention to the far corner. The dog's body stiffened. Nose pressed hard against the shadows. David swung the beam and saw nothing at first, but Ranger began pawing furiously, claws scraping against the cement, the sound sharp in the confined space. David stepped closer, crouched, and moved the light across the corner. There, half hidden by debris, lay a crumpled bundle of fabric. He reached for it, fingers brushing the material, and pulled it free. It was a woman's coat, the fabric once pale, but now smeared with dirt and streaked with something darker. David lifted it higher, and the beam caught the stain. Blood. Dark and tacky at the edges, long dried into the fabric. His chest tightened. He held the coat away from him, staring at the size, the style modern, recent, not something forgotten for decades. Someone had worn this not long ago. He searched the pockets with quick, methodical movements. Inside one, he found a small piece of paper with the letters RLR Outpost 7 scrawled in hasty handwriting. No wallet, no phone, nothing else that could identify the owner. He set the coat gently on the bench, eyes scanning the map again, the dots burning into his vision. Ranger paced restlessly, tail low, every motion charged with unease. David pressed his hand briefly to the shepherd's back, steadying both the dog and himself. The basement felt smaller now, the air heavier, as though the walls leaned closer with each second. The silence was absolute, broken only by the dog's breathing and David's own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He aimed the flashlight back toward the staircase the way out, but his feet stayed rooted. His soldier's mind cataloged what he saw, the map with its damning markers, the tools arranged with intent, the coat with fresh blood. It all pointed in one direction, a pattern that could not be dismissed. Someone had used this place not as a home, but as a hub, a point of control, and they had done so recently. David adjusted his grip on the flashlight, his knuckles pale, and let the beam crawl over the shadows one more time. He felt the certainty settle in his bones that the cabin was not empty, that the traces he had uncovered were not relics of the past, but signs of something ongoing, something he had just stepped into without invitation. Ranger's growl rose again, low and steady, reverberating in the confined space. David steadied his breath, eyes fixed on the darkness just beyond the circle of his light, aware that whatever had left these traces might not be far away at all. The ride back to town felt longer than it should have, the snow crunching under the tires of David's truck as the forest stretched endlessly behind him. Ranger lay curled in the passenger seat, his breathing shallow but steady, the faint scent of dried blood still clinging to his fur. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind replaying the map and the coat over and over, each detail etching deeper into his thoughts. He had been in situations where uncertainty could cost lives, and now every instinct screamed that the cabin's secrets pointed to something ongoing and dangerous. The town came into view as the road widened, a cluster of lights cutting through the early evening haze. David drove straight to the sheriff's office, the brick building standing stoic against the October wind. Inside, the warmth was immediate, the air filled with the faint hum of a heater. Behind the desk sat Sheriff Blackwood, broad-shouldered, with eyes that barely lifted from the paperwork in front of him when David entered. David introduced himself plainly, his voice carrying the weight of both discipline and urgency. He laid out the facts as methodically as he would have delivered a field report: the cabin in the woods, the chained door, the basement map marked with red dots, the bloodied coat. He spoke of the possible connection to the disappearances. He had heard whispers about the danger, that someone might still be trapped, or worse. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the desk, his expression unreadable. When David finished, silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, the man gave a small shake of his head, his voice calm but dismissive. That patch of land's been listed as empty for decades. No structures, no residences, nothing on record for the past 30 years. David knew the A-frame sat on a sliver just past the county line, rebuilt off the books after an old fire, easy for tax records to miss. You must have wandered into some hunter's old shelter. David felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the same one he had felt when higher-ups once brushed aside warnings that later proved costly. He pressed again, sharper now, describing the coat in detail, the map on the basement wall. But Blackwood's gaze hardened as if he had decided not to be swayed. "I'll file your statement, but without evidence there's nothing to pursue. You should let it go." David wanted to argue, but years of command had taught him when words would only meet a wall. He nodded curtly, turned and walked out, Ranger petting stiffly at his side. The cold air outside hit him like a slap, sharper than before, as though the town itself rejected what he had brought back from the forest. He knew he needed answers somewhere else, somewhere less bound by procedure and more by memory. The bar on Main Street stood quiet, its wooden signs swaying in the wind, the paint faded to near illegibility. Inside, dim yellow bulbs cast long shadows across scarred tables and shelves lined with dusty bottles. The place smelled of tobacco and old wood comfort laced with sorrow. Only a few patrons sat scattered, their shoulders hunched over drinks. David chose the counter, laying the folded coat gently on the wood. The bartender was an older man, thin, with a shock of white hair, polishing a glass with slow, deliberate movements. Frank, according to his name tag, had the weathered look of someone who had spent a lifetime in the same small town. When Frank's eyes fell on the coat, the glass slipped from his hands and clattered harmlessly on the counter. His face drained of color, his hands trembling, as though a ghost had stepped out of the forest and laid itself before him. David spoke softly, asking if he recognized it. The old man swallowed hard, his voice rough when he finally answered. "That belonged to Jennifer Reynolds. She vanished last winter. Elementary school teacher, always came here after church on Sundays. They searched for weeks, but the snow buried everything. People said she must have gotten lost in the woods." His eyes rose to David's, and in them burned a fear that time had not dulled. "Where did you find this?" David hesitated, then said only in a place that shouldn't exist. Frank shook his head slowly, his gaze drifting to the corner of the bar, as if seeing memories etched into the wood grain. "That house," he said, finally voice breaking. "That triangular roof. I heard about it from my grandfather even when I was a boy. Folks used to warn us never to wander near that part of the woods. Too many went missing, too many stories without endings. Some said hunters found traces, but never the people themselves. And then it stopped being talk and started being silence because silence was safer." David let the words sink in, each one confirming what he had already begun to piece together. The code, the map, the dismissive sheriff, and now this old man's haunted memories all pointed in one direction. The A-frame was no relic. It was alive with secrets. Ranger shifted beside him, ears pricked, as if he too understood that the trail was far from over. Frank's gaze settled on the dog recognition flickering in his eyes. "That's one of the dogs from out that way. Seen a few like him over the years, always managed to escape somehow. Most weren't so lucky." David rested a hand on Ranger's head, feeling a deeper connection to the animal now. Not just a survivor, but perhaps the only witness to whatever happened at that cabin. Frank leaned closer, lowering his voice. "There's a woman you should talk to. Rachel Parker works for the Pine County Herald. Been trying to write about the missing persons for years, but they never publish her stuff. Says it's too speculative, not enough hard facts. But she keeps files, lots of them. Might be able to tell you more than I can." David committed the name to memory, nodding his thanks. As he turned to leave, Frank called after him. "Be careful, Miller. Some secrets in this town run deeper than that forest, and some people would rather keep them buried." The warning settled heavy in David's chest as he stepped back into the night, Ranger at his heel. He checked his watch, almost 9. Ethan would be wondering where he was. He needed to get home, make sure his son was safe before pursuing this any further. The Pine County Herald occupied a small brick building on Cedar Street, its windows dark at this hour, save for one on the second floor. David found the side entrance unlocked and climbed the narrow stairs, Ranger following cautiously behind. A nameplate on the last door read, "R. Parker Local Affairs." David knocked and the door opened to reveal a woman in her late 30s, brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, glasses perched on a nose that seemed perpetually wrinkled in concentration. Rachel Parker's expression shifted quickly from surprise to wariness when she saw a stranger at her door after hours. "Can I help you?" Her voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone used to interviewing people who didn't always want to talk. David introduced himself, mentioned Frank from the bar, and watched her wariness deepen. She began to close the door. "Look, I don't know what Frank told you, but I'm busy with actual stories right now." David reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded coat. "Maybe you can tell me who this belonged to, and why Sheriff Blackwood doesn't seem to care." The coat froze her mid-motion. For a long moment she stared at it, then at David, then at Ranger, sitting patiently beside him. Finally she stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in." But this better not be some sick joke. Rachel's office looked more like a war room than a journalist's workspace. One entire wall was covered with a large corkboard pinned with photographs, newspaper clippings, maps, and strings connecting different items. Names and dates were scrawled on index cards, forming a timeline that stretched back years. Missing person flyers, at least a dozen, formed the centerpiece of the display. Rachel took the coat from David with careful hands, examining it closely. This was Jennifer Reynolds. I interviewed her students after she disappeared. She was wearing this coat the day she vanished. Her voice faltered. "Where did you find it?" David described the cabin, the basement, the map with red dots. With each detail, Rachel's eyes widened further. She moved to her board, pointing to specific locations. "Every red pin on this map is a person who went missing in these woods over the last 5 years. 12 people total, all reported to Sheriff Blackwood, all classified as accidents, exposure, or simply people passing through who must have moved on." Her finger tapped on Jennifer's picture. But they didn't move on. They never left these woods. She turned back to David, studying him with new intensity. "Why do you care about this?" "Most people in town avoid the subject completely." David hesitated, then decided on the truth. "I recognize patterns. I was a Navy SEAL, 2 tours in Afghanistan. When multiple disappearances cluster in one area, when local authorities dismiss concerns without investigation, When physical evidence is ignored, these aren't coincidences. Someone is hunting in these woods. Rachel nodded slowly, seeming to accept his explanation. She moved to her desk, pulling out a thick file folder. I've been collecting statements from junior deputies, park rangers, search and rescue volunteers. They all say the same thing: investigations into these disappearances get shut down almost immediately, transferred to other departments that never follow up. Evidence goes missing. Witness statements get altered. She spread photographs across her desk, snapshots of the missing people, 12 faces looking back at David with the innocence of not yet knowing their fate. All different ages, genders, backgrounds. A retired teacher, a hiker passing through, a local mechanic, a college student home for break. The only commonality is that they were vulnerable in some way, alone when they disappeared. Few strong local connections, people who wouldn't be missed immediately or whose absence could be explained away. David studied the faces, committing them to memory. What do you make of this? He placed the note from the coat pocket on her desk. RLR Outpost 7. Rachel's eyes widened with recognition. Ridge Lake Rangers. It's a hunting outfit about 15 miles north of here. They have cabins for rent during hunting season. They call them outposts. She pulled up a map on her computer, pointing to a location deep in the forest. Right here. I tried to investigate them last year after finding a connection to two of the missing persons. Both had receipts for cabin rentals there in their bank statements. But when I went out there, the manager claimed they had no record of either person staying with them. David felt the pieces beginning to connect. Do you have a photo of this manager? Rachel searched through her files and pulled out a surveillance photo of a heavy-set man with a receding hairline. Greg Turner, ex-military, moved here about 6 years ago, very protective of his privacy and his business. The military connection pinged David's radar. Too many coincidences were stacking up. What's our next move? Rachel raised an eyebrow at our, but didn't correct him. I'd say we need to check out Ridge Lake Rangers, but not officially. No questions, no interviews, just observation. Something's happening there, but every time I've tried the direct approach, doors slam shut. David nodded, the tactical part of his brain already mapping possibilities. We'll go tomorrow. But first I need to get home to my son. As if on cue, his phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Thompson. Ethan asking where you are. Should I tell him you're working late? Guilt washed over David. In his focus on the investigation, he had lost track of time. He texted back quickly. On my way, tell him I'll be there in 20. To Rachel, he said, I'll pick you up at 9 a.m. We'll approach from the forest side, not the main road. As David drove home with Ranger in the passenger seat, his mind churned with what they'd discovered. The pattern was clear now: systematic disappearances deliberately ignored by local authorities. But why? What connected Sheriff Blackwood to these events? What was happening at Ridge Lake Rangers? And most disturbing of all, who was operating out of that A-frame cabin? The lights of his modest cabin came into view, a welcome sight after the darkness of the forest. He parked and let Ranger out, the dog still moving stiffly, but with more energy than before. Mrs. Thompson opened the door before he reached it, relief evident on her kind face. I was starting to worry, David. It's not like you to be out so late without calling. He apologized, explaining he had car trouble, a lie that tasted bitter, but seemed safer than the truth. Mrs. Thompson accepted it without question, gathering her things to leave. She paused at the sight of Ranger, who sat patiently by the door. Well, who's this? Her voice softened as she bent to pet the shepherd. Found him injured on the road. David kept his explanation simple. Going to nurse him back to health. Miss Thompson smiled. Good for you, and good for Ethan too. That boy needs something to care for. After she left, David found Ethan in his room, already in pajamas, but still awake, a book open on his lap. The boy looked so much like Sarah sometimes that it hurt, the same thoughtful eyes, the same slight furrow when concentrating. Dad, where were you? His voice carried equal parts relief and accusation. David sat on the edge of the bed, searching for words that wouldn't be outright lies. I found someone who needed help on my way home. He's waiting in the living room to meet you. Ethan's eyes widened. Who? His name's Ranger. He's had a rough time, but I think he's going to be okay. Curiosity overcame sleepiness as Ethan followed his father to the living room. When he saw Ranger, his face lit up with a joy David hadn't seen in months. A dog. We got a dog. The shepherd looked up at Ethan, ears perked forward, tail giving a tentative wag. Despite his injuries, Ranger rose and approached the boy, sniffing carefully before pressing his head against Ethan's hand in a gesture of trust. He found me, actually. David watched the connection forming between his son and the dog, a small light in the darkness that had been following him all evening. He needs care and time to heal. Think you can help with that? Ethan nodded solemnly, already stroking Ranger's head with gentle hands. What happened to him? He's hurt. David chose his words carefully. Someone was cruel to him, but he escaped. He's very brave. Ethan's face darkened with a child's pure sense of injustice. Why would anyone hurt a dog? Some people do terrible things, son. David's mind flashed to the map in the cabin basement, each red dot a life taken. But there are always more good people than bad. We just have to be among the good ones. While Ethan bonded with Ranger, David prepared a comfortable bed for the dog near the fireplace, adding one of Sarah's old blankets to the makeshift bedding. He cleaned and rebandaged the wound on Ranger's flank, noting with relief that it looked better already. Later, after settling Ethan in bed with promises that Ranger would still be there in the morning, David sat alone at the kitchen table, his mind unable to rest. He sketched the cabin layout from memory, marking the locations of the map, the workbench, the hidden trapdoor. He listed the names of the missing people from Rachel's board, trying to see connections he might have missed. The coat, the map, Ridge Lake Rangers, Sheriff Blackwood, 12 missing people. Each piece suggested a larger pattern, but the complete picture remained elusive. A whine drew his attention to Ranger, who stood watching him, eyes gleaming in the dim light. The dog patted over, nudging David's hand with his nose before turning toward the bathroom. Might as well get you cleaned up properly, David muttered, leading Ranger to the tub. He ran warm water, gently wetting the dog's matted fur, working in mild soap with careful hands. As he worked around the neck, his fingers felt something unusual beneath the thick fur, a small lump that shouldn't be there. David parted the fur to reveal a tiny pocket sewn into what remained of Ranger's original collar, cleverly hidden beneath the leather. He carefully cut the stitches with his pocket knife, extracting a small object, a micro SD card sealed in waterproof wrapping. His heart rate quickened. Someone had deliberately hidden this on the dog, perhaps expecting Ranger to be found. Or perhaps Ranger's escape was never part of the plan, and this was evidence that should have remained hidden. David dried Ranger quickly, then went to his laptop. The micro SD card slid into the adapter, and he held his breath as the computer recognized the device. A single folder appeared containing dozens of image files. The first photo showed Ridge Lake Ranger's main lodge from a distance, clearly taken with a telephoto lens. The next several captured people entering and exiting the building, some David didn't recognize. But one face stood out immediately, Sheriff Blackwood shaking hands with Greg Turner. David continued scrolling, his blood running colder with each image. Another photo showed a familiar face that stopped him cold, Colonel Richards, his former commanding officer presumed missing after discharge 3 years ago. Yet here he was, very much alive, standing outside one of the Ridge Lake cabins, deep in conversation with a man in black tactical gear. More photos revealed different outpost cabins, vehicles with out-of-state plates, and most disturbing of all, several faces that matched Rachel's missing persons board. Jennifer Reynolds appeared in one image, being escorted from a vehicle into Outpost 7, looking disoriented. The final set of images showed a larger facility deeper in the forest, a compound with multiple buildings surrounded by security fencing. The file name was labeled Training Center Alpha. David sat back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about disappearances. This was organized, methodical, with military precision. Whatever was happening involved ex-military personnel, local law enforcement, and a careful system for selecting and processing victims. He reached for his phone to call Rachel, but paused when he heard a soft sound from Ethan's room. He found his son sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his face. I had the dream again, Dad. The one about Mom. David sat on the edge of the bed, pulling Ethan into a tight hug. The nightmare had been recurring since Sarah died. Ethan searching through an empty hospital, unable to find his mother or father, calling out with no one answering. I'm right here, bud. I'm not going anywhere. He stroked his son's hair until the boy's breathing steadied. Want to tell me about it? Ethan shook his head, burying his face against David's chest. Just stay for a while. David nodded, stretching out beside his son on the narrow bed. Within minutes, Ethan had drifted back to sleep, but David remained awake, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars they had stuck to the ceiling together last summer. Sarah had always been the one to comfort Ethan after nightmares. David still felt like an understudy in a role he was never prepared to play. A soft patting of paws announced Ranger's arrival. The shepherd surveyed the room before settling on the floor beside Ethan's bed, positioning himself like a guardian. David watched the dog's vigilant posture with newfound understanding. Ranger hadn't just escaped abuse, he had been entrusted with evidence. Someone inside whatever operation was happening had turned against it, using the dog as an unlikely courier. When Ethan's breathing fell into the deep rhythm of secure sleep, David carefully extracted himself from the bed and returned to his laptop. He spent the next hour documenting everything he had found, copying the photos to a secure cloud storage account and preparing notes for Rachel. One image in particular demanded closer examination, a photo showing a whiteboard in what appeared to be an office at the compound. Though partially obscure, David could make out what looked like a list of names. He zoomed in, enhancing the image as much as possible, and felt his heart skip when he recognized one of the names near the bottom: E. Miller, 12, Pine Creek Elementary. Ethan's name, his son's school. On a list in a compound connected to 12 disappearances, cold fury replaced the investigative calm that had carried David through the evening. This was no longer just about uncovering a mystery or seeking justice for strangers. They had his son's name. They were watching Ethan. David checked the time, nearly 2 a.m. He needed to contact Rachel, but first he had a decision to make about Ethan. Should he send his son away to safety? Confront the threat directly? Involve federal authorities immediately? As he weighed options, Ranger padded into the room, ears alert, body tense. A low growl rumbled in the dog's throat as he faced the front window. David moved silently to the side of the curtain, peering out into the darkness. For a moment he saw nothing, then caught the faint gleam of moonlight reflecting off metal, a car parked just beyond the tree line, and its headlights off. Someone was watching the house. David moved with practiced, quiet checking that Ethan still slept before retrieving his gun from the lockbox in his closet. He positioned himself where he could monitor both the front approach and the hallway to Ethan's room. Ranger crouched beside him, a silent ally, in the darkness. Minutes stretched into an hour. The car remained its occupant, invisible behind tinted windows. David considered his options: confront the watcher, call local police, potentially alerting Blackwood, or wait it out. None seemed ideal with Ethan asleep and vulnerable. Finally, around 3 a.m., the car's engine started and it pulled away slowly, lights still off, until it reached the main road. David memorized what he could see of the license plate, a partial sequence that he immediately wrote down. Sleep was impossible now. David used the remaining hours before dawn to prepare. He called Mrs. Thompson, asking if Ethan could stay with her for a day or two, citing a work emergency. The kind woman agreed without hesitation, accustomed to helping since Sarah's death. He packed a small bag for his son, including favorite books and comfort items, trying to make it seem like a normal sleepover rather than an evacuation. When morning came, David woke Ethan with forced cheerfulness, explaining he needed to handle an urgent project and that he'd be staying with Mrs. Thompson. The boy was disappointed but brightened when told Ranger would be coming to pick him up later. After dropping Ethan at the neighbor's with a too-tight hug and promises to call that night, David returned home to find Rachel's car already in his driveway. Her expression was grim as she met him at the door. "We have a problem. Greg Turner called the newspaper this morning asking specifically about me. Said he heard I was asking questions about Ridge Lake Rangers again. My editor warned me to drop it or face suspension." David ushered her inside, closing the blinds before showing her the micro SD card and images. As Rachel scrolled through the photos, her face paled, then flushed with vindication. "I knew it. I've been right all along. This proves everything." Not everything, David countered, but enough to know we're dealing with something bigger than local disappearances. This is organized military precision operation. He showed her the image with Ethan's name, watching her eyes widen with understanding. "They're targeting your son." Her voice dropped to a whisper. David nodded grimly. "And someone was watching my house last night. We need to move fast, but carefully. I've sent Ethan somewhere safe for now." Rachel studied the compound photos with a journalist's attention to detail. "I recognize this place. It's an old lumber processing facility abandoned in the 90s, about 50 miles north, deep in the national forest, technically outside Blackwood's jurisdiction. Do you think that's where they're taking people after Ridge Lake?" Rachel nodded slowly. "It would make sense. Isolate them first in the cabins, then move them to a more secure facility for whatever they're doing. David outlined his plan: first observe Ridge Lake Rangers from a distance, confirm the connection to the recent activity at the A-frame cabin, then decide whether to approach the larger compound or contact federal authorities. Rachel agreed but added, "We should document everything. Multiple backups. If something happens to either of us, the evidence needs to survive." They spent the next hour preparing, gathering supplies, cameras with telephoto lenses, emergency provisions. David left Ranger at home to rest and recover the dog, reluctantly settling on his new bed after a stern command to stay. As they were about to leave, David's phone rang Mrs. Thompson's number. His stomach knotted as he answered. "David," Mrs. Thompson's voice trembled. "There's a police car here. Sheriff Blackwood says there's been an incident involving you and he needs to speak with Ethan. I told him I needed to call you first." David's military calm took over, his voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in his mind. "Don't let him near Ethan. Tell him I'm on my way and we'll meet him at the station with my lawyer. Do not let Ethan out of your sight." He ended the call, meeting Rachel's questioning gaze with cold determination. "They're moving faster than we expected. Blackwood's trying to get to my son." Rachel's expression hardened. "Then we move faster too. I have a friend at the FBI field office in Portland. We bypass local authorities completely." David nodded, grabbing his keys. "But first we get Ethan somewhere truly safe. If they're willing to use a child to get to me, there's nothing they won't do." As they headed for the door, David's phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. The message contained only 4 words, but they sent ice through his veins. "We have your son." Time collapsed into a single pulsing point. David's mind sharpened with cold fury as he read the text message again. "We have your son." 4 words that demolished the careful structure of his world. The phone felt impossibly heavy in his hand. Rachel's face drained of color as she read over his shoulder. They couldn't have taken him this quickly. Mrs. Thompson just called. David was already dialing, each ring stretching into eternity. When Mrs. Thompson finally answered, her voice came through, choked with sobs. "They took him, David. 2 men in uniforms. They showed badges, said there was an emergency involving you. I tried to stop them, but they pushed past me. I'm so sorry." The floor seemed to tilt beneath David's feet, but his military training kept him upright, focused. "What kind of uniforms? What did the badges look like? Which direction did they go?" Mrs. Thompson described dark blue uniforms with no distinct markings, badges that looked official enough to fool a civilian in a black SUV heading north out of town. David ended the call with a promise to find Ethan, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Rachel was already at her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm sending everything we have to my FBI contact. They need to mobilize now." David shook his head, checking his weapon. "The FBI will take hours to mobilize a team. Ethan doesn't have hours." His phone chimed again with another text. "Training Center Alpha. Midnight, alone. Bring all evidence or he dies." Attached was a photo of Ethan, terrified eyes staring at the camera, a dark bruise forming on his cheek. Something ancient and primal rose in David's chest, a rage so pure it transcended emotion. The soldier in him calculated, planned, assessed. The father in him burned. "I know where they're taking him," David said, showing Rachel the compound photos from the micro SD card. "If they're following protocol, they'll process him at Ridge Lake first, then transport to the main facility. We have a window to intercept." Rachel stepped back, studying his face. "You're not actually considering going in alone?" "Not alone." David's eyes flicked to his phone. "I'm calling in a favor." 10 minutes later, David had spoken with Lieutenant Jenkins, a former teammate from his SEAL unit, who now worked private security in Seattle. Jenkins was already on the road, promising to meet them near Ridge Lake in 3 hours. He'd bring equipment, weapons, and the kind of expertise that didn't come with a badge. Rachel watched David gather supplies with mechanical precision. First aid kit, ammunition, night vision goggles, communications gear, all packed into a tactical backpack that hadn't seen use since Afghanistan. "This is suicide," she whispered, not a question but a statement of fact. David didn't pause as he checked each item. "Maybe. But the alternative isn't an option." When he finished packing, David knelt beside Ranger, gently examining the dog's wounds. The shepherd seemed stronger, already pressing against David's hand with renewed vigor. You're coming too, aren't you? No way I could stop you. As if understanding, Ranger rose to his feet, alert and ready despite his injuries. Rachel shook her head in disbelief, but didn't argue further. She made a single call to her editor, explaining she'd be unreachable for personal reasons, then transferred all their evidence to multiple secure locations, including a scheduled email to her FBI contact if she didn't reset the timer within 24 hours. They left in David's truck, Ranger in the back seat, heading north toward Ridge Lake Rangers. The road grew narrower as they penetrated deeper into the forest, autumn leaves swirling in their wake like fragments of flame. David drove with focused intensity, reviewing the mental map of the area, calculating time and distance, formulating and discarding plans with each passing mile. Rachel broke the silence as they approached the turnoff for Ridge Lake. If Richards and Blackwood are involved, this goes beyond just trafficking. There's something bigger happening. David nodded, eyes never leaving the road. Military precision, military personnel. This has the structure of a training operation. But training for what? They stopped a mile from Ridge Lake Rangers, pulling off onto a Forest Service road and continuing on foot. Ranger led the way, moving with surprising stealth despite his injuries, pausing occasionally to scent the air. David checked his phone, still 2 hours before Jenkins would arrive. They would use that time for reconnaissance. The forest thickened around them, pine needles cushioning their steps as they approached from the north, using the natural contours of the land for cover. When they reached the perimeter, David signaled a halt, retrieving binoculars from his pack. Ridge Lake Rangers consisted of a main lodge and 12 smaller cabins arranged around 2 small lakes. From their vantage point on a wooded ridge, David could see unusual activity at Outpost 7, 3 vehicles parked outside, men in tactical gear, moving equipment, a perimeter guard making regular circuits. Rachel pointed to a black SUV partially visible behind the cabin. That matches Mrs. Thompson's description. They could have Ethan in there. David studied the setup, counting personnel, noting weapons, identifying patterns in the guard rotations. His mind translated civilian buildings into a tactical scenario, approaches, vulnerabilities, defensive positions. 7 armed men visible, possibly more inside. Too many for a frontal assault, even with Jenkins' help. A sudden commotion drew their attention. The cabin door opened and 2 men emerged, half dragging a struggling figure between them. Even from a distance, David recognized his son's red jacket, the small body twisting futilely against adult strength. The sight sent a surge of rage through him, so powerful he had to physically restrain himself from charging down the hill. Rachel grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Wait, we need to see where they're taking him." The men forced Ethan into the SUV. Moments later, Colonel Richards emerged from the cabin, his posture military straight despite civilian clothes. He spoke briefly to the others before climbing into a separate vehicle. The convoy, 3 vehicles total, began moving north away from the main lodge. David and Rachel retreated quickly, returning to the truck and following at a distance, headlights off, navigating the forest roads by moonlight and memory. "They're taking him directly to the compound," Rachel whispered, tracking the convoy's position on a forestry map. "Why change the pattern?" David's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Because Ethan isn't just another victim. He's leverage against me." The realization hardened his resolve. He'd been naive to think they could intercept the convoy safely. The compound was their only option now. He texted Jenkins the updated coordinates, then pulled off onto a side road when the convoy was no longer visible ahead. They drove in silence for several miles, finally stopping at an abandoned fire watchtower that provided a view of the valley below. The training center Alpha compound sprawled across a cleared section of forest, 4 main buildings arranged in a square, surrounded by security fencing, with guard towers at each corner. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter, creating a harsh island of artificial day in the wilderness night. Through binoculars, David watched the convoy arrive, pass through a security checkpoint, and disappear inside the largest building. His chest constricted at the thought of Ethan inside that place, frightened and alone. Rachel studied the compound with growing horror. There must be dozens of people in there. This isn't just about the 12 missing from Pine County. David surveyed the security measures, motion sensors, cameras, armed guards, reinforced gates. Breaking in would be nearly impossible. Breaking out with Ethan even more so. For the first time since Afghanistan, he felt the cold weight of a mission that might not have a successful outcome. "We need more than just Jenkins," Rachel said, her voice barely audible. "We need a full tactical team, federal agents, helicopters." David shook his head. Richards has my son. He's given me until midnight to surrender with the evidence. If I don't show or if any authorities appear, his throat closed around the words he couldn't bring himself to speak. They retreated to a hunter's cabin Rachel knew of, abandoned for the season, but offering basic shelter. David spread maps across a dusty table marking approaches, security positions, possible extraction routes. Ranger prowled the small space restlessly, occasionally returning to press against David's leg, as if offering silent support. Jenkins arrived as dusk was falling, his weathered face grim, as he unloaded equipment from his SUV. The former SEAL embraced David briefly, then immediately focused on the tactical situation. When David explained about Ethan Jenkins' expression darkened. I've been tracking Richards since he disappeared. There were rumors he was building something off-grid, recruiting former operators. People thought he'd gone paranoid, started a militia. This is much worse. Jenkins had brought a small arsenal, firearms, tactical gear, communications equipment, even basic explosives. As they sorted through the supplies, he shared what intelligence he'd gathered about Richards' operation over the past 2 years. He's created a training program using real civilians as subjects. Conditioning techniques similar to what we saw in Afghanistan, but refined. Breaking people down, rebuilding them with absolute loyalty. The graduates get sold to private military contractors, foreign governments, anyone willing to pay for operators with no identity, no background, and no moral limitations. The horror of it settled over them. David tried not to imagine what they might already be doing to Ethan. The boy was only 12, too young for their usual program, but perfect as leverage against a father who had stumbled too close to their operation. We go in at 11:30, David said, marking the compound entrance on the map. I'll approach the front gate alone as instructed. While they're focused on me, Jenkins takes the east perimeter. Rachel stays here as our communications hub, and to ensure the evidence reaches authorities if we don't return. Rachel shook her head firmly. I'm coming with you. I've been investigating this for 3 years. I know these people, their patterns, their protocols. You need me. David studied her face, seeing not just determination, but competence. She'd survived in these woods while being hunted, escaped from the compound on her own. She wasn't military, but she had skills they needed. Jenkins nodded his agreement. 3 entry points are better than 2. Plus she can handle the dog. Ranger's ears perked up at the mention, his intelligent eyes moving between them. David had been planning to leave the injured shepherd behind, but now he reconsidered. The dog knew the compound had somehow escaped from it. He might be their most valuable asset. As they continued planning, David's phone chimed with a text from the unknown number. Proof of life is requested. The attached video showed Ethan in a sterile room, bruised but alive, stating today's date and that he was being treated okay. The fear in his eyes told a different story. David replayed the video, scrutinizing every detail of the room, Ethan's condition, anything that might help. What caught his attention was almost imperceptible Ethan's hand gesture as he spoke, tapping his thumb against his forefinger 3 times. It was their private signal and developed after Sarah died, meaning, I'm scared but thinking clearly. His son was telling him something important. David studied the video again, this time looking beyond Ethan to the room itself. There, reflected in a metal cabinet behind Ethan, the partial image of someone just out of frame. David enhanced the image as much as possible and felt his blood run cold. The person monitoring Ethan wasn't some anonymous guard. It was Sheriff Blackwood. David shared this discovery with the others. Richards is using local law enforcement as security. They'll have police protocols, equipment, communications. They revised their plan accordingly, accounting for police-grade weapons and tactical training. By the time darkness fully descended, they had a workable strategy, high risk, but with contingencies for various scenarios. Midnight approached with agonizing slowness. They used the remaining hours to prepare their equipment, synchronize communications, and study the compound layout one final time. David checked and rechecked his weapons, each mechanical movement a prayer for his son's safety. When it was time to move out, he knelt beside Ranger, securing a small camera to the dog's collar. If anything happens to us, find a way out. Get this footage to someone who can help. The shepherd's eyes seemed to understand the gravity of the request, his posture straightening with purpose despite his injuries. David wondered again who had originally sent Ranger with that micro SD card. Perhaps they still had an ally inside the compound. They approached the facility from 3 different directions, maintaining radio silence until they reached their designated positions. David circled to the main entrance, while Jenkins took the east side near the power generators, and Rachel and Ranger positioned themselves by the northwest fence line where the security cameras had a blind spot. At exactly 11:30, David stepped out of the forest shadow and walked directly toward the main gate, hands visible, movements deliberate. Two guards spotted him immediately, weapons raising voices calling for him to stop. "I'm here to see Colonel Richards. He's expecting me." The guards exchanged glances, one speaking into a radio, while keeping his weapon trained on David. Moments later, the gate began to open. Four more armed men emerged surrounding David, efficiently disarming him and searching for additional weapons or devices. They missed the miniaturized transmitter sewn into his jacket collar, the one component of their plan that couldn't fail. David allowed himself to be escorted inside, memorizing the layout, counting personnel, noting security measures. The compound was even larger than it had appeared from a distance, with subterranean levels indicated by ventilation structures and multiple access points. They led him to the central building through a series of security checkpoints, each more stringent than the last. The final door opened into what appeared to be a command center monitors, displaying security feeds, communications equipment, maps covering the walls. At the center stood Colonel Richards, still powerful at 60, his silver hair cropped in the same military cut he'd worn in Afghanistan. Beside him, Sheriff Blackwood looked less comfortable, his uniform out of place among the tactical gear worn by the others. "So good of you to join us, Mr. Miller." Richard's voice hadn't changed, the same calm authority that had once commanded respect, now sending chills down David's spine. "I trust you've brought what we discussed." David produced a flash drive from his pocket. "Everything I found at the cabin. Everything Rachel Parker collected over 3 years. Names, dates, locations." Richards took the drive without examining it, passing it to a technician at a nearby console. His focus remained entirely on David's eyes, calculating, assessing. "You were always observant, one of my best operators. I wondered if you'd recognize me after all these years. Where's my son?" David kept his voice level, betraying none of the rage coursing through him. Richards gestured to a monitor showing Ethan in the same room from the video, now sleeping or unconscious on a narrow cot. "Safe for now. His future depends entirely on you." Sheriff Blackwood shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his watch. "We had a deal, Colonel. I help you clean up this mess, you're gone by morning. The feds are already asking questions." Richards didn't acknowledge the sheriff, his attention fixed solely on David. "You have questions. I can see them burning behind your eyes. Ask them while my men verify the data you've brought." "What are you doing here?" David needed to keep them talking. Buy time for Jenkins and Rachel to get into position. "The trafficking, the training program, it's not like you." A flash of something, perhaps disappointment, crossed Richard's face. "I thought you of all people would understand. We're building something essential, something this country desperately needs, but is too weak to create officially. Operators with no identity, no history, no connection to any government agency. Completely deniable assets who will follow orders without question." David glanced at the monitors, watching armed personnel moving through the compound. "How many people have you taken?" Richard smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "We've processed 117 subjects through this facility. 43 have successfully completed the program. The rest were unsuccessful. Your son would have been special, our first youth candidate. Children adapt remarkably well to conditioning." The casualness with which Richards discussed destroying human lives sent ice through David's veins. The colonel had always been ruthless, but this crossed into genuine monstrosity. On the security monitors, David noticed a momentary flicker, the power fluctuating slightly. Jenkins had reached the generators. All this to create what assassins mercenaries David needed to keep Richards talking, his attention focused away from the security systems. "Patriots," Richards corrected, his voice hardening. "Warriors willing to do what's necessary without the constraints of law or conventional morality. The threats this country faces don't respect rules of engagement. Neither can we." A technician approached, whispering something in Richard's ear. The colonel's expression darkened. He turned back to David, the pretense of civility vanishing. "The drive you provided is empty. Where are the real files?" David met his gaze without flinching. "Safe. Release my son, and you'll get what you want." Richard studied him for a long moment, then nodded to one of his men. Bring the boy. While they waited, David surreptitiously checked his watch. 11:47. Jenkins should be in position at the power station. Rachel and Ranger would be approaching the northwest section where most of the prisoners were held, according to the facility schematics. Sheriff Blackwood paced nervously, his earlier confidence eroding with each passing minute. This wasn't the deal, Colonel. The boy wasn't supposed to be involved. Just the journalist and the evidence. David filed this information away, so Blackwood had drawn a moral line somewhere, however faint. Perhaps that could be leveraged if needed. Two guards entered, half carrying Ethan between them. The boy looked dazed, smaller somehow in the harsh fluorescent lighting, but his eyes cleared when he saw his father. Dad. His voice cracked with relief and fear. It's okay, Ethan. David forced confidence into his voice. Everything's going to be fine. Richards positioned himself between them. Very touching. Now, Mr. Miller, the actual evidence, please. Or shall I demonstrate what the first phase of conditioning serves like? David felt the countdown ticking in his head. 11:52. They needed 8 more minutes. Your problem is with me, not him. Let him go and I'll tell you where to find everything. Richards laughed softly. Your negotiating position is rather weak. His hand moved to Ethan's shoulder, fingers digging in until the boy winced. We already have you. We already have your son. The only variable is how much pain is involved in getting what we want. Before David could respond, the facility's lights flickered, then went out completely. Emergency lighting activated seconds later, bathing everything in dim red glow. Alarms began blaring throughout the compound. Richards's composure cracked for the first time. What's happening? A guard burst in, breathless. Sir, we have a perimeter breach in sectors 3 and 7. The backup generators aren't responding. Richards' eyes snapped back to David, rage, replacing the clinical detachment. Who did you bring with you? Now, David transmitted, silently pressing the concealed button in his sleeve 3 times. Now. The explosion at the East Power Station rocked the entire compound, the concussion wave rattling windows and knocking equipment from desks. In the confusion, David launched himself forward, tackling Richards to the ground, while simultaneously pulling Ethan away from the guards. Sheriff Blackwood drew his weapon but hesitated, caught between conflicting loyalties. The moment of indecision cost him. David kicked upward from his position on the floor, connecting with the sheriff's wrist, sending the gun spinning across the room. Ethan under the desk, David shouted as gunfire erupted from the hallway, Jenkins engaging the security team right on schedule. Richards fought with surprising strength for his age, military training evident in every movement. They grappled on the floor, each seeking advantage, while chaos erupted around them. Guards shouted conflicting orders, alarms continued wailing, and gunfire echoed through the facility. David managed to pin Richards momentarily, landing 2 solid punches that left the older man dazed. He scrambled toward the fallen sheriff's weapon, reaching it just as more guards burst into the room. David fired twice, hitting one in the shoulder, forcing the others to take cover. Ethan. David called, gesturing toward the side door he'd noted earlier. Stay low. The boy darted from under the desk, keeping his body hunched, as David had taught him during their camping trips. Together, they slipped through the door into a maintenance corridor, David firing one more shot behind them to discourage pursuit. They need to get to the northwest section, where Rachel and Ranger should be freeing the other prisoners. The diversion at the power station wouldn't keep Richards' forces occupied for long. Dad, I'm scared. Ethan whispered, his small hand gripping David's with desperate strength. David squeezed back reassuringly. I know, buddy, but you're doing great. Just like we practiced in our camping drills. Remember, stay low, move quick, listen carefully. They navigated through service quarters, avoiding the main hallways where armed personnel were rushing to respond to the multiple security breaches. Twice they had to hide in storage closets as patrols passed. David's military experience guided them through the facility each turn, bringing them closer to the rendezvous point. A familiar bark echoed from somewhere ahead. Ranger had found their scent. Moments later, the German Shepherd appeared around a corner, Rachel close behind him. Her face showed relief at seeing them both alive, quickly replaced by urgency. The northwest exit is clear for now, but they're regrouping fast. Jenkins is creating diversions on the east side, but he's pinned it down. Together, they move toward the exit, Ranger leading the way, his keen senses alert for danger. They pass doors with observation windows, glimpses of sterile rooms with beds and restraints, some occupied by hollow-eyed people who barely looked up at their passing. Rachel paused at a control panel, typing rapidly. Security locks disengaging in the detention wing. Anyone who can move will have a chance. A siren wailed in a different pattern containment breach. Behind them, shouts and pounding footsteps indicated guards rushing to secure the prisoners. Their window of opportunity was closing fast. They reached the northwest exit only to find it had been sealed heavy metal shutters deployed during the security alert. Rachel examined the control panel, shaking her head in frustration. "We need a key card, security level A." Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out a plastic card. "Will this work?" "I took it from the man watching me when he fell asleep." David stared at his son in amazement. "You picked his pocket." Ethan shrugged, a ghost of his normal self shining through the fear. "You always said to pay attention to what people leave lying around." The card worked, the shutters rising just enough to allow them to crawl underneath. They emerged into the cold night air, the forest edge tantalizingly close beyond the perimeter fence. Ranger led them to the spot he'd escaped through before a drainage culvert passing under the fence, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. David went first, then helped Ethan through, Rachel following with Ranger. They had made it perhaps 50 yards into the forest when floodlights blazed to life behind them, illuminating the compound perimeter. Gunshots rang out, bullets splintering tree trunks around them. "Run!" David pushed Ethan ahead, using his body to shield his son as they sprinted deeper into the darkness. Rachel and Ranger flanked them, the four moving as a unit through the underbrush, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers. They reached the first rally point, a dense thicket, 200 yards from the compound, and paused to catch their breath. David activated his emergency transmitter, sending the prearranged signal to Jenkins. If the former SEAL had made it out, he would meet them at the second rally point. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew, voices, dogs, the mechanical whine of ATVs. Richards wouldn't let them escape easily. Not with what they knew, not with what they'd seen. "We need to split up," Rachel whispered. "They'll expect us to stay together." David shook his head. "We're stronger together, and I'm not letting Ethan out of my sight." They continued moving, using every evasion tactic David knew, crossing streams to break their scent trail, doubling back, creating false tracks. Ethan kept pace admirably, fear giving him endurance beyond his years. At the second rally point, a lightning-struck pine, visible from a distance, they found Jenkins waiting, his left arm hastily bandaged, face streaked with soot from the explosions. "East side's a war zone," he reported tersely. "Got at least 6 of them, but there are dozens more. They've called in reinforcements from somewhere. They can't risk outside attention," David reasoned. "Local sheriff's department, maybe other recruits. Not much time then." Jenkins checked his remaining ammunition with practice movements. "We need to get to the vehicles and clear the area before they establish roadblocks." Their emergency extraction plan had 2 vehicles hidden at different locations. Jenkins's SUV, 3 miles northeast, and a 4-wheel drive Rachel had borrowed from a friend concealed 2 miles northwest. They decided to split up. David and Ethan would take the northwest route with Rainer, while Rachel and Jenkins headed northeast, each group with evidence and the ability to contact federal authorities independently. "If anything happens, get the evidence out," David insisted. "Make sure this place gets shut down no matter what." As they prepared to separate, the distant sound of helicopters reached them, not medical or news choppers, but the distinctive thrum of military-grade aircraft. Richards had more resources than they'd anticipated. The separation point was a small clearing beside a stream. As they said hurried goodbyes, Ranger suddenly stiffened, a low growl building in his throat. From the darkness behind them, a voice spoke with terrible calm. Going somewhere, Miller Colonel Richards stepped into the faint moonlight, flanked by Sheriff Blackwood and 2 armed men. All 4 had weapons trained on the group. Richards' face showed signs of the earlier struggle, a split lip, darkening bruise along his jaw, but his eyes remained coldly focused. "Quite the operation you've mounted, impressive truly, but ultimately futile." Richards gestured with his weapon. "On your knees, all of you, hands where I can see them." David positioned himself in front of Ethan, mind racing through scenarios each more desperate than the last. Behind Richards, shadows moved in the forest, more of his men surrounding them. Sheriff Blackwood looked increasingly uneasy, his weapon not quite steady in his hands. "This has gone too far, Colonel. We agreed no civilians would be harmed, especially no children." Richards didn't even glance at the sheriff. "Casualties are inevitable in any operation, Sheriff. You knew the parameters when you joined us. I joined to protect this county from drug traffickers and criminals, not to kidnap children or murder innocent people." Blackwood's voice rose with each word, his face flushed with what appeared to be genuine shame. The weapon in his hand shifted, no longer pointing at David's group, but hovering somewhere between them and Richard's. The colonel noticed the movement, his expression hardening. "Are you having an attack of conscience, Sheriff? Rather late in the proceedings, wouldn't you say?" For a moment, the tableau held five armed men in a silent battle of wills, with Ethan, Rachel, and Ranger caught in the middle. Jenkins edged closer to David, his posture indicating readiness to move at the slightest opportunity. The distant helicopter sounds grew louder, the aircraft approaching rapidly. Richards glanced skyward briefly, then refocused on David. "Your reinforcements won't arrive in time. Put the boy on the ground or we open fire on everyone." It was Ranger who broke the standoff. With no warning, the shepherd launched himself at the nearest guard, a blur of fur and teeth that sent the man sprawling, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the air. In the same instant, Sheriff Blackwood made his choice, swinging his gun toward Richards and firing once. The bullet caught Richards in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around. His men hesitated, caught between targets, and in that moment of indecision, Jenkins and David moved simultaneously. Jenkins tackled one guard, while David charged Richards, both men hitting the forest floor with bone-jarring force. Ethan ran with Rachel. David shouted as he grappled with Richards, the older man's military training evident in every countermove. The colonel fought with the desperate strength of a man who knew defeat meant the end of everything he'd built. He landed a crushing blow to David's ribs, then reached for a backup weapon concealed at his ankle. David caught his wrist, forcing the gun away as they rolled across the damp ground, each seeking the advantage that would end the fight. Around them, chaos erupted, Jenkins engaging the second guard, Ranger still harrying the first, Sheriff Blackwood exchanging fire with Richard's reinforcements arriving from the forest edge. Rachel pulled Ethan behind a fallen tree, shielding him with her body while returning fire with her own weapon. The helicopter sounds crescendoed overhead, powerful searchlights cutting through the canopy to illuminate the clearing in harsh white light. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "This is the FBI. Cease fire immediately. Lay down your weapons." Richard's face contorted with rage and disbelief. With a final surge of strength, he broke David's grip and brought his weapon up, not toward David, but toward where Ethan sheltered with Rachel. No, Sheriff Blackwood launched himself forward, his body intercepting Richard's aim as the colonel fired. The sheriff crumpled to the ground, blood spreading across his uniform, but his sacrifice had given David the opening he needed. David drove his fist into Richards's wounded shoulder, causing the colonel to howl in pain and lose his grip on the weapon. A second blow rendered him unconscious, his body going limp beneath David's weight. The FBI tactical team rappelled from the helicopter, securing the clearing with practiced efficiency, disarming Richard's remaining men. David rushed to Ethan, gathering his son in a crushing embrace, relief flooding through him so powerfully it threatened to wash away consciousness itself. "Is it over, Dad? Is it really over?" Ethan's voice trembled against David's chest. David looked up at the FBI agents, securing Richards at Jenkins, receiving medical attention at Rachel, explaining the situation to the team leader. Ranger limped to their side, pressing against them both in canine solidarity. The night still echoed with distant gunfire from the compound, the operation to free the remaining prisoners continuing without them. "It's over for us," David whispered, holding his son tighter. "We're going home." Dawn broke over Pine County Hospital with the hesitant quality of light, too weary to fully commit to the day. David sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his body a catalog of fresh injuries, 3 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder now reset, and enough bruises to map every moment of the previous night's struggle. None of it registered against the relief of watching Ethan sleep in the hospital bed beside him, the boy's face peaceful for the first time in 24 hours. FBI agents guarded the door outside their presence, a reminder that the danger hadn't fully passed. Richards might be in custody, but his network remained partially intact. The federal response had been overwhelming. 3 helicopters, dozens of agents, coordination with state police to seal off access routes. They'd arrived too late to prevent the confrontation in the forest, but in time to secure the compound and begin processing what one agent had described as a crime scene unlike anything we've encountered. A soft knock preceded Rachel's entrance. She carried 2 cups of coffee, dark circles shadowing her eyes, but something fundamental had shifted in her demeanor, the driven intensity replaced by quiet resolve. "Brought you hospital coffee. Terrible but medicinal." She placed one cup on the side table and took the seat beside David, careful not to disturb Ranger, who lay curled protectively at the foot of Ethan's bed. The shepherd had refused to leave the boy's side, growling at hospital staff who initially tried to enforce their no animals policy. Someone had eventually found a therapy dog vest, granting Ranger unofficial status to remain. How many did they get out? David's voice felt raw in his throat. Rachel sipped her coffee, grimacing at the taste. 43 survivors found in the facility, 17 in critical condition from their conditioning process. At least a dozen staff members in custody, but many escaped during the raid, including key personnel with direct ties to Richards. David nodded, absorbing the information. The compound had been larger than they initially estimated, with underground levels they hadn't detected from their reconnaissance. The FBI had discovered documentation of operations dating back nearly 4 years, with financial connections to private military contractors' offshore accounts in foreign governments, seeking deniable assets for black operations. Jenkins, David asked, remembering the former SEAL's bloodied arm. Surgery for the gunshot wound, but he'll recover. Rachel's mouth curved in a slight smile, already arguing with the doctors about discharge papers. The observation pulled a weary chuckle from David. The tight brotherhood of special operations formed bonds that transcended years and distance. Jenkins had dropped everything and driven 4 hours on the strength of a single phone call. A nurse entered to check Ethan's vitals. The boy stirred slightly, but didn't wake, his body still processing the trauma of captivity. The doctor had found evidence of sedatives in his system, nothing permanently harmful, but enough to keep him compliant during transport. When the nurse left, Rachel leaned closer, her voice dropping. The FBI agent in charge, Pearson, wants to debrief you as soon as you're ready. They need your statement to connect everything, especially about Richard's involvement with your military unit. David nodded, though the prospect of reliving the past 24 hours held little appeal. His mind kept returning to the moment in the forest when Richards had aimed at Ethan, the cold calculation in the colonel's eyes, the absolute certainty that he would sacrifice a child to protect his operation. I keep wondering when it happened, David murmured. When Richards crossed that line. Was it in Afghanistan? Was it happening right in front of us and we just couldn't see it? Rachel considered the question with a journalist's analytical detachment. According to the files they have recovered, he started planning this almost immediately after his discharge. The psychological evaluations in his military records showed increasing signs of what they termed moral flexibility in his final year of service. David remembered rumors that had circulated through the unit, whispered concerns about methods that crossed lines, about detainees who emerged from questioning broken in ways that went beyond physical injury. Now he wondered how many warning signs he'd ignored. There was something else in the files, Rachel continued, hesitation evident in her tone. Richards kept detailed assessments of potential recruits from his former units. Your name was on a list of priority acquisitions officers with specific skill sets he wanted to bring into the operation. There were surveillance reports dating back 2 years, David. He's been watching you. The revelation sent a chill through David despite the hospital's overheated air. Richards had been observing him during the darkest period of his life, Sarah's illness and death, his struggle to rebuild a life for Ethan, the nightmares and isolation and grief that had nearly consumed him. Had Richards been waiting for him to break, to become desperate enough to accept whatever offer might come? Ethan stirred in the hospital bed, eyelids fluttering before opening fully. For a moment, confusion clouded his features, then recognition and relief as he found his father's face. Dad, the single word carried layers of questions. David moved to the bedside, resting his hand on his son's. I'm here, buddy. You're safe now. We're in the hospital, but you're going to be fine. Ranger responded to Ethan's waking by crawling up from the foot of the bed, nudging his nose gently against the boy's hand. Ethan's fingers automatically buried themselves in the shepherd's fur, drawing comfort from the warm presence. Did they catch the bad men? The simplicity of the question, reducing the sprawling conspiracy to a child's clear moral categories, struck David with unexpected force. They caught Colonel Richards. David confirmed, and they're looking for the others. You don't need to worry about them anymore. Ethan nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. His next question came more hesitantly. What about the other people? The ones in the rooms like mine? David exchanged a glance with Rachel, surprised by his son's awareness. Even in captivity, frightened and alone, Ethan had been observing, processing. They're safe too. The FBI is helping them. Ethan absorbed this, finger still moving methodically through Ranger's fur. His next question cut straight to the core of David's own tortured thoughts. Why did they do it, Dad? Why did they hurt people? The question hung in the sterile hospital air, impossible to answer adequately, yet impossible to dismiss. David considered and discarded several responses before settling on the painful truth. Sometimes people convince themselves that doing terrible things is necessary for what they believe is a greater good. They start making exceptions to rules they once followed, crossing lines they never thought they would. Before they realize it, they've become something they wouldn't recognize. The explanation felt inadequate even as he spoke it, but Ethan seemed to consider it seriously, his young face solemn with contemplation. Like in your stories about the war, when you said the hardest thing was remembering who you were supposed to be, David felt his throat tighten at his son's unexpected connection. Yes, exactly like that. Colonel Richards forgot who he was supposed to be. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. FBI Special Agent Pearson entered, a tall woman with prematurely gray hair and the focused intensity of someone who had dedicated decades to pursuit of justice. She nodded to Rachel, then turned her attention to David. Mr. Miller, I apologize for the intrusion. I understand you need rest, but we're working against the clock to contain this situation. The information you have could be critical to preventing Richards' associates from destroying evidence or harming additional civilians. David glanced at Ethan, reluctant to leave him even with Rachel present. Agent Pearson noticed his hesitation and softened her approach slightly. We can conduct the interview here if your son is comfortable with that, or we can arrange for a protective detail while you're debriefed elsewhere. Ethan made the decision for them. I'll be okay with Rachel and Ranger Dad. The boy's voice carried a new maturity, a resilience forged in the crucible of the past day's events. You should help them catch the rest of the bad guys. Pride mingled with sorrow in David's chest, pride at his son's courage, sorrow that circumstances had forced such rapid growth. He squeezed Ethan's hand once more before following Agent Pearson from the room. The FBI had commandeered a hospital conference room, transforming it into an impromptu command center. Maps covered one wall, the compound Ridge Lake Rangers, the A-frame cabin with red pins marking confirmed locations connected to Richards' operation. Another wall displayed photographs of known associates, many with apprehended stamped across them, others still unmarked. David recognized several faces from his military days, men who had served under Richards in various capacities, now apparently recruited into his private army. The realization that so many former brothers in arms had willingly joined this operation sent a wave of nausea through him. Agent Pearson gestured to a chair across from where another agent sat with a laptop ready to transcribe. We need everything, Mr. Miller. Start from when you found them all and walk us through each development chronologically. For the next 3 hours, David recounted the entire sequence of events, finding Ranger on the road, discovering the A-frame cabin, the map with red dots marking disappearances, his dismissal by Sheriff Blackwood, connecting with Rachel, uncovering the micro SD card in Ranger's collar, the surveillance of Ridge Lake Rangers, Ethan's kidnapping, the infiltration of the compound, and finally the confrontation in the forest. Throughout the debriefing, other agents occasionally entered with updates, speaking in hushed tones to Pearson before departing. David noticed the command center's activity level increasing, a sense of urgency pervading the room. When he finally finished his account, Pearson studied him with evaluative intensity. Your military background shows in the precision of your observations, Mr. Miller. This information, combined with what we've recovered from the compound and Ms. Parker's investigation, gives us a clearer picture of Richard's operation than we anticipated. David leaned forward, his body protesting the movement. What aren't you telling me? There's something else happening. Pearson hesitated, then apparently decided that transparency served their mutual interests. Richards is refusing to cooperate, claiming diplomatic immunity through connections that technically don't exist. More concerning, we've intercepted communications suggesting a cleanup operation is underway. 3 additional facilities like Training Center Alpha have been mentioned, one in Idaho, one in Southern Oregon, and one location still unidentified. The scope of the conspiracy expanded in David's mind like a blast radius. One facility had held over 40 prisoners and required dozens of personnel to operate. 3 more suggested an organization far larger than he'd imagined. How high does this go? David asked the question, emerging unbidden. Pearson's expression remained carefully neutral, but her eyes betrayed concern. We're still mapping the network. Preliminary financial analysis shows connections to several private military contractors, a cybersecurity firm with government contracts and at least two political action committees. Richards appears to have been creating a private intelligence and operations capability outside any governmental oversight. David absorbed this, his tactical mind automatically assessing implications. You're worried about interference in your investigation. From inside the government. Not officially, Pearson replied, her careful wording confirming his suspicion. But we're proceeding with heightened security protocols. Which brings me to my next question. What are your plans once your son is discharged? The question carried layers of meaning David immediately recognized. If Richards' network extended into government agencies, standard witness protection protocols might be compromised. He and Ethan could remain targets. We have family in Colorado. David offered the lie smooth and practiced. My late wife's sister has been asking us to visit since the funeral. Might be a good time for that trip. Pearson nodded, understanding the subtext. I think that's an excellent idea, Mr. Miller. Perhaps Miss Parker might benefit from a change of scenery as well, given her extended investigation into these matters. The implication was clear. Stay together, stay mobile, stay off official radar until the full extent of Richards' network could be mapped and neutralized. David felt a familiar tension settle across his shoulders, the hypervigilance of deployment returning like a second skin. And Ranger David asked, thinking of the shepherd who had become instrumental to their survival. Pearson actually smiled slightly. Our forensics team is quite interested in the individual who placed that micro SD card in the dog's collar. The evidence suggests we have an ally inside Richards' organization, someone with enough access to document operations, but who couldn't risk direct contact with authorities. The dog appears to be the messenger. I'd suggest keeping him close. When the debriefing concluded, David returned to Ethan's room to find the boy engaged in a game of cards with Rachel Ranger, watching attentively from his position on the bed. The domesticity of the scene struck a chord of longing in David's chest, a glimpse of normalcy amid chaos. The doctor says I can leave tomorrow, Ethan announced as David entered. My blood test came back clean. David nodded, relief mingling with the weight of decisions that couldn't wait. We need to talk about next steps. All of us. His gaze included Rachel, acknowledging that her involvement had irrevocably connected her fate to theirs. He outlined Pearson's concerns about the scope of Richards' network and the potential need to remain mobile until the FBI could ensure their safety. Rachel received the news with journalist pragmatism, already considering angles and implications. My editor's been calling nonstop, Rachel said, holding up her phone with its screen full of notifications. This will be the biggest story of my career, but I can't file it until the FBI clears specific details for release. Ethan followed the adult conversation with solemn attention, his usual restlessness absent. When there was a natural pause, he asked the question David had been avoiding. Are we going home at all? Or do we have to leave forever? The simplicity of the question carried the weight of everything. A 12-year-old valued his school, his few friends, the house filled with memories of his mother, the stability David had fought to maintain since Sarah's death. David sat on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. Not forever, buddy. But we need to take a trip for a little while until the FBI finishes their work. Think of it as an adventure, just not the scary kind. Ranger sensed the emotional current in the room, moving to press his body reassuringly against Ethan's side. The boy buried his fingers in the dog's fur, drawing comfort from the contact. Can Ranger come with us? Absolutely, David confirmed. He's part of our family now. The word family hung in the air, its boundaries shifting to potentially include Rachel, whose investigation had become intertwined with their safety. She caught David's glance and answered the unspoken question. I have a cabin in the Cascade Mountains. It belonged to my grandfather, off-grid, accessible only by Forest Service roads, no digital footprint. We could disappear there while the FBI does their work. The offer solved immediate logistical problems while creating more complex emotional ones. Sharing confined space with Rachel would blur the careful boundaries David had maintained with everyone since Sarah's death. Yet circumstances left few alternatives that would ensure Ethan's safety. Before David could respond, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Raised voices preceded Agent Pearson's appearance at the door, her expression tense with controlled urgency. We need to move you. Now. Richards escaped during transport between facilities. 2 agents down, 1 critical. We believe he had inside help. The news hit David with physical force, adrenaline flooding his system despite his exhaustion. How long? 37 minutes ago. We're implementing emergency protocols. Pearson gestured to additional agents appearing in the hallway. Gather only essential items. We have a secure vehicle waiting. The hospital room erupted into focused activity. Rachel collected their few belongings while David helped Ethan dress Ranger, pacing anxiously as he picked up on the tension. Within minutes, they were moving through the hospital corridors flanked by armed agents, headed toward a service elevator that would bypass the main exits. David's mind raced through scenarios, assessing threats and responses. Richards would be injured from their confrontation and subsequent arrest, limiting his physical capabilities, but not his strategic thinking. The colonel knew David's training tendencies and weaknesses from years of command. Most concerning, he now had a personal vendetta beyond the operational security that had motivated the initial attempt to silence them. The elevator descended to the basement level, opening onto a loading dock where an armored SUV waited, engine running. Agent Pearson directed them inside, then handed David a satellite phone. This line is secure and traceable. I'll contact you once we've reestablished containment. Until then, go dark. No credit cards, no cell phones, no social media, nothing that creates a digital footprint. David accepted the phone, recognizing the gravity in Pearson's eyes. What aren't you telling me? The agent glanced at Ethan, then back to David, lowering her voice. We found a contingency plan in Richard's personal files. If his operation was compromised, he had extraction protocols prepared, including offshore resources and new identities. But he also had a secondary objective listed: fire insurance. We believe that's code for eliminating witnesses and anyone who could testify against him. The implications were clear. Richards wouldn't simply flee. He would hunt them first, eliminating the primary threats to his freedom and future operations. David nodded grimly, the weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders. 2 additional agents would accompany them for the first 100 miles, establishing a false trail before separating to create multiple potential trajectories for any pursuers to track. After that, they would be on their own, David, Ethan, Rachel, and Ranger, against whatever resources Richards could still command from his fractured network. As the SUV pulled away from the hospital, David studied his son's profile against the tinted window. Ethan had withdrawn into himself, the brave face he'd maintained in the hospital room, giving way to the fear he'd been suppressing. David reached across to take his hand, offering the only reassurance possible under the circumstances. This won't be forever, David promised. Richards is injured on the run with limited resources. The FBI will find him. Ethan nodded without speaking, his fingers tightening around his father's. Ranger rested his head on the boy's lap, intuiting the need for comfort. From the front passenger seat, Rachel monitored police frequencies on a scanner provided by the FBI. Her journalist focus narrowed to the immediate crisis. They traveled in tense silence as the SUV navigated back roads, avoiding main highways and population centers. 2 hours into the journey, Rachel turned from the scanner, her expression troubled. They found the vehicle Richards used to escape, abandoned at a private airfield 30 miles from the transport route. A plane was reported missing, small Cessna 4-seater, range of about 800 miles. The information shifted David's tactical assessment. Air travel expanded Richards's potential radius significantly, though small aircraft were limited by fuel capacity and weather conditions. If he'd acquired transportation after landing, he could be anywhere within a several-state region by now. At a predetermined rendezvous point, an abandoned fire station on national forest land, they transferred to a nondescript pickup truck with Oregon Plate supplies redistributed to maintain mobility. The FBI agents departed in the SUV, headed east to create a diversionary trail, while David took the wheel of the truck and turned north toward the Cascade Mountains. Rachel provided directions to her grandfather's cabin, navigating from memory as they left paved roads for increasingly rugged Forest Service tracks. Ethan had finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping in the backseat, with Ranger maintaining vigilant guard beside him. Why did you keep investigating? David asked Rachel as they crossed into national forest land, the question that had lingered since their partnership began. After the newspaper refused to publish, after the sheriff dismissed you, after all the dead ends. Why continue? Rachel stared out at the darkening forest, her profile illuminated intermittently by the dashboard lights. 3 years ago, my sister disappeared while hiking near Mount Hood. The investigation found nothing, no body, no evidence of foul play, just a backpack near a trail. They concluded she'd had an accident or been attacked by wildlife. She paused, collecting herself before continuing. But Emily was an experienced hiker who'd navigated those trails since childhood. When I started looking into other disappearances in the region, patterns emerged, locations timing the type of person who vanished. Law enforcement dismissed the connections. So I kept pulling the thread. Her personal connection to the investigation recontextualized everything that had followed her persistence, her willingness to risk her career and safety, the depth of her research. It wasn't just professional dedication, but a sister's determination to uncover the truth. "Did you find any connection to Emily in the files from the compound?" David asked gently. Rachel shook her head, a mixture of disappointment and relief in her expression. "Not directly, but the timing and location fit their operational pattern. The FBI is reviewing recovered records that weren't accessible during the raid. If there's any mention of her, they'll find it." The truck rounded a bend in the Forest Service road, headlights illuminating a wooden gate blocking further progress. Rachel indicated they should continue on foot. The cabin lay a quarter-mile ahead, accessible only by a narrow path designed to prevent vehicular approach. David gathered essential supplies while Rachel gently woke Ethan, explaining the final leg of their journey. The boy roused slowly, disoriented from deep sleep, but Ranger's presence beside him provided immediate reassurance. They set off along the path, flashlights illuminating the way through dense forest. After 15 minutes of hiking, the trees opened to reveal a small clearing dominated by a sturdy log cabin nestled against a granite outcropping. The cabin's interior smelled of cedar and wood smoke, preserved by regular maintenance despite years of intermittent use. A central room combined kitchen and living space with two small bedrooms extending from the main area. Kerosene lamps provided warm illumination as Rachel lit them one by one. David secured the perimeter, checking sightlines, potential approaches, defensible positions, his military training automatically assessing their tactical situation. The cabin's location offered excellent security, elevated position, clear views of the only approach path, natural barriers on three sides. If Richard somehow tracked them here, he would find no easy target. When he returned inside, Rachel had prepared a simple meal from supplies they'd brought and staples stored in the cabin's pantry. Ethan sat at the rough-hewn table, fatigue evident in the slump of his shoulders despite his attempt to remain alert. David helped his son prepare for bed in one of the small bedrooms, Ranger taking up position at the foot of the mattress without being invited. As he tucked Ethan in, the boy's questions reflected the uncertainty that had invaded their lives. "How long will we stay here? When can I go back to school? Will those men keep looking for us?" David settled on the edge of the bed, stroking his son's hair back from his forehead, a gesture Sarah had often used to comfort him. "I don't have all the answers yet, buddy, but I promise I'm doing everything I can to get us back to normal as soon as possible." The reassurance felt hollow even as he spoke it. Richards had abandoned everything: his operation, his personnel, years of planning to escape custody. Such a man wouldn't simply disappear when his vendetta remained unfulfilled. Ethan studied his father's face with disconcerting perception. "It's okay to be scared too, Dad. Mom always said being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid." The invocation of Sarah's wisdom pierced David's careful composure. For a moment, he allowed himself to be simply a father, rather than a soldier, vulnerable, uncertain, drawing strength from the very child he sought to protect. "You're right, Mom was pretty smart about those things." When Ethan finally drifted to sleep, David returned to the main room where Rachel sat by the wood stove satellite phone beside her notebook open on her lap. She'd been documenting everything since their escape from the hospital, creating a contemporaneous record with journalist thoroughness. "No word from Pearson?" David asked, sinking into a chair opposite her. Rachel shook her head. "They're maintaining communication blackout until they're certain secure channels haven't been compromised." She gestured to her notes. "I've been mapping what we know about Richard's network based on the files we saw and the compound layout. There are significant gaps, but patterns are emerging." She turned the notebook to show him a diagram of connected entities: private military contractors, shell companies overseas, accounts, training facilities. At the center sat Richards, with lines radiating outward to individuals and organizations, some marked with question marks indicating uncertainty. David checked his watch, nearly 1 a.m. Exhaustion pulled at him with inexorable force, but he resisted, unwilling to surrender to sleep, while questions remained unanswered and threats unresolved. Rachel noticed his struggle and closed her notebook. "You need rest, David. You've been running on adrenaline for 2 days. I'll take first watch." The offer surprised him, not the tactical awareness it displayed, but the assumption of shared responsibility for their safety. He'd been operating in protective mode, seeing Rachel primarily as another person to defend rather than an ally in their security. "Wake me in 4 hours," David agreed, recognizing the wisdom in rotating surveillance. "Ranger will alert us to anyone approaching." But still, Rachel nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. The satellite phone sat between them on the table, silent and somehow accusatory in its lack of communication. Both knew that each hour without word from the FBI could indicate either progress in the manhunt for Richards or complications they couldn't anticipate. He woke fully at the sound of Ranger's low growl just before dawn. The shepherd stood at the bedroom doorway, ears forward, body tense with alertness. David rose immediately, retrieving the weapon he'd kept within reach, and moved silently to the main room. Rachel was already at the window rifle from the cabin's emergency supplies in her hands. She acknowledged David with a slight nod, then returned her attention to the forest edge visible in the gray pre-dawn light. "Something triggered the motion sensor I set up on the approach path," she whispered. "Could be wildlife," but Ranger started growling before the alert sounded. David joined her at the window, scanning the tree line with practiced eyes. The forest appeared undisturbed, morning mist clinging to the understory, creating ghostly shapes among the trunks. Nothing moved yet. Ranger's continued alertness confirmed an intruder's presence. "Get Ethan," David instructed, moving toward the rear of the cabin. "There's a trail behind the outcropping, narrow but passable. If someone found us, we need alternative exits." Rachel hesitated only briefly before complying, disappearing into Ethan's room while David checked the satellite phone. Still no communication from Pearson or the FBI team. He made a split-second decision, activating the phone to send a brief text to the emergency contact number. "Possible compromise at location. Moving to secondary position." Rachel emerged with a still groggy Ethan, the boy clutching his backpack, confusion and fear evident in his expression. Ranger positioned himself protectively beside the child, hackles raised, as he continued to sense the approaching threat. "Dad, what's happening?" Ethan's voice trembled with the strain of too many emergencies in too short a time. David knelt to his son's level, maintaining calm for the boy's benefit. "Remember our camping trips when we practiced emergency hikes? This is just like that. We need to move to a different spot for a little while." They moved out in single file, Rachel leading with the rifle, Ethan and Ranger in the middle, David bringing up the rear with his handgun at ready. They had ascended perhaps 200 yards when the first gunshot shattered the dawn stillness. David instinctively pushed Ethan down behind a boulder, scanning the forest below with tactical focus. Movement caught his eye, a figure in the dark clothing, moving with military precision between trees, approaching the now empty cabin. The distance was too great for reliable identification, but the controlled, methodical advance spoke of professional training. "They must have tracked the satellite phone," Rachel whispered. "They've been monitoring the emergency frequency." The implication chilled David's blood. If Richards had access to the FBI's emergency channels, his network extended even further into federal agencies than they'd feared. "You take Ethan and Ranger ahead to the vehicle," David decided, transferring additional ammunition to Rachel. "I'll create a diversion, make them think we're moving in a different direction. Meet you at the junction in 40 minutes. Rachel started to protest, but the hard reality of their situation silenced her objections. With David providing cover and diversion, Ethan had a better chance of reaching safety. She nodded grimly, accepting the tactical necessity, if not the emotional cost. David knelt beside Ethan, whose wide eyes reflected understanding beyond his years. The boy had absorbed enough of their circumstances to recognize a goodbye, even one disguised as a temporary separation. "I need you to go with Rachel and Ranger now," David said, keeping his voice steady through sheer will. "Stay quiet, move fast, do exactly what she tells you. I'll catch up soon. I just need to make sure these men don't follow you." Ethan's face crumpled momentarily before he mastered himself, a child forced into adult comprehension by circumstance. "Will you promise, really promise?" The question laid bare the fragile trust between them, a son who had already lost one parent, now faced with the potential loss of another. David pulled him into a fierce embrace, memorizing the feel of his son's small frame against his chest, the scent of his hair, the rapid flutter of his heart. "I promise, buddy. Nothing in this world could keep me from coming back to you." David released him reluctantly, meeting Rachel's eyes over the boy's head. "Take care of him, whatever happens." Rachel's nod carried the weight of a sacred oath. She gathered Ethan close ranger pressing protectively against the boy's side and began moving upward toward the firebreak. David watched until they disappeared around a bend in the trail, then turned his attention to the tactical problem below. He circled west along the ridge, finding a position that offered both cover and a clear view of the cabin clearing. From his vantage point, he could now see three individuals, the two at the cabin and a third covering the original trail. Their equipment confirmed his suspicions: tactical gear, military-grade weapons, communications, headsets. These weren't local law enforcement or FBI agents, but specialized operators, likely former military recruited by Richards. David selected a flat stone from the ground, waited for the team leader to emerge from the cabin, then threw it hard against a tree trunk far to the east of his position. The sharp crack echoed through the forest, instantly drawing the attention of all three pursuers. They converged on the sound with disciplined movement, exactly as their training would dictate. As he moved through dense underbrush, a voice called from below, controlled volume pitched to carry just far enough without revealing the speaker's exact position. A voice David recognized instantly. "I know you can hear me, Miller," Richards' voice strained with pain but retaining its commanding authority. "This doesn't have to end badly for your son. My quarrel is with you and the journalist, not the boy." David remained motionless, controlling his breathing, as he'd been taught in sniper school, making no sound that might betray his position. Richards continued, his voice moving slightly as he repositioned. "You were always one of my best, David. Disciplined, resourceful, loyal to a fault. Those qualities made you valuable then, and they make you dangerous now. I respected that enough to come personally rather than sending others to finish this." "Think about Ethan," Richards called, his voice taking on a conversational tone that belied the lethal intent behind it. "He's already lost his mother. If you force this confrontation, he loses you too. Surrender now. Tell me where Parker is hiding with her evidence, and I guarantee the boy will be delivered safely to his grandmother in Ohio." The psychological warfare was expertly crafted, targeting David's greatest vulnerability, his son's welfare. Then he remembered Ethan's face when they'd rescued him from the compound, the relief, the trust, the absolute certainty that his father would always come for him. And he recalled the promise he'd just made on the mountainside. "Nothing in this world could keep me from coming back to you." As David reached a position near the firebreak, he heard the faint sound of an engine starting in the distance. Rachel had reached the vehicle with Ethan. Now David needed to disengage from the pursuers and rendezvous with Rachel at the predetermined location. He retrieved a small tin of emergency fire-starting material from his packed magnesium shavings and waterproof matches. Moving quickly but methodically, he prepared three separate piles at different points along the ridge, each positioned to create maximum visual impact while minimizing actual forest fire danger. When the preparations were complete, David lit the first pile, creating a sudden flare of intense light and smoke visible from the cabin clearing. Immediately, he heard Richards barking orders to his team, directing them toward the disturbance. As they moved toward the first fire, David ignited the second, creating the impression of multiple people signaling from different positions. The confusion would force Richards to split his team, diluting their effectiveness and creating gaps in their coverage. The third fire provided cover for David's final movement, a rapid traverse across exposed ground to reach the old logging road Rachel had described. Once there, he broke into a controlled run, maintaining situational awareness while covering ground as quickly as possible. Behind him, sporadic gunfire indicated Richards' frustration, shooting at potential movement or simply attempting to flush out hidden targets. The sounds grew fainter as distance increased, confirming David had successfully broken contact with the pursuit team. The junction where Rachel's grandfather had concealed the emergency vehicle appeared ahead, a weathered storage shed partially concealed by strategic plantings of native vegetation. The padlock had been broken, the door standing open, tracks in the soft earth, showing where a vehicle had recently departed. David approached cautiously, weapon ready, scanning for potential ambush. A small piece of paper had been secured to the inside of the door, with a thumbtack, a hastily scrawled note in Rachel's handwriting. "Heading to Extraction Point Alpha. Vehicle operational but low fuel. Will wait until noon." Extraction Point Alpha was a small airfield operated by a retired bush pilot Rachel had interviewed years earlier during an environmental story, a man who owed her a favor and asked no questions. David calculated distance and time. The airfield lay approximately 20 miles northeast, reachable via Forest Service roads that connected to state highways. On foot traversing difficult terrain while avoiding detection, he estimated 10 to 12 hours of hard travel. Hours passed as he navigated the wilderness using every skill acquired through military training and subsequent survival courses. By midday, he had covered nearly half the distance to the airfield, though fatigue and his existing injuries slowed progress more than he'd calculated. As he prepared to resume travel, a distant sound froze him in place, the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. He pressed deeper into cover, watching as a black helicopter passed overhead, flying low enough to indicate a search pattern rather than normal transit. The aircraft bore no visible identification markings, neither law enforcement nor military, suggesting private ownership. Richards had apparently escalated his resources, perhaps drawing on contacts from his network of private military contractors. By late afternoon, an exhaustion threatened to override training and willpower. David's pace had slowed his injured ribs, protesting each breath, shoulders burning from the weight of his pack. Yet the thought of Ethan waiting at the airfield, counting on his promised return, drove him forward step by painful step. Through binoculars, he surveyed the airfield, a single gravel runway, a weathered hangar, and a small operations building. On the apron sat an aging Cessna, its white and blue paint faded by years of sun exposure. Near the plane stood Rachel, scanning the forest edge with obvious tension. Ranger paced nearby, occasionally raising his nose to test the wind. Of Ethan, there was no immediate sign, likely inside the operations building for safety. David observed for 20 minutes, confirming no signs of surveillance or ambush, before beginning his final approach. He used a dry creek bed for cover, moving in short bursts between observation pauses, the ingrained caution of military operations keeping him alive through countless dangerous situations. When he emerged from the tree line at the airfield's edge, Ranger alerted first the shepherd's head, lifting sharply, ears forward, body suddenly tense with attention. Rachel followed the dog's gaze, relief washing visibly across her features as she recognized David's approach. "Dad." The joyous cry came from the operations building doorway as Ethan burst outside, sprinting across the gravel, with Ranger loping beside him. The boy threw himself into his father's arms with such force that David staggered backward, pain from his injuries eclipsed by the overwhelming relief of reunion. "You came back. You really came back." Ethan's words muffled against David's chest, tears soaking through the fabric of his shirt. David held his son tightly, his own eyes burning with exhaustion and emotion. "I promised, didn't I? Nothing in this world could keep me away." Rachel approached more slowly, giving them space for their reunion while maintaining vigilant watch on their surroundings. When Ethan's grip finally loosened, she addressed the practical concerns that couldn't wait. "Ted's prepping the plane now," Rachel explained, nodding toward the hangar where an elderly man worked on the Cessna's engine. "He can take us to a private airfield in Idaho owned by a friend of his. From there, we have ground transportation arranged to a safe house." As they crossed the gravel toward the waiting aircraft, David maintained vigilant awareness of their surroundings. The helicopter had not reappeared, but instinct told him Richards would not abandon the pursuit so easily. The colonel's resources might be diminished, his network compromised, but his determination would remain undiminished. Ted directed them to board while he completed final preparations. The Cessna's interior was cramped, but functional seats worn smooth by decades of use. Ranger hesitated at the unfamiliar entry, but followed Ethan's encouragement to jump inside, settling nervously at the boy's feet. As Ted began pre-flight checks, Rachel handed David a folder containing documentation of everything they'd learned about Richards' operation, copies of her original research photographs from the compound, statements from survivors being treated at the hospital, and transcripts of Richards' known associates. "Insurance," she explained simply. "Multiple copies exist in secure locations scheduled for release to federal authorities and media outlets if we don't check in regularly. Even if Richards finds us, his secrets don't die with us." The strategic thinking impressed David, creating deterrence through distributed information, ensuring that silencing them would no longer protect Richards' remaining operations. It might not prevent the colonel from seeking personal vengeance, but it removed the operational necessity that had driven the initial pursuit. As the engine roared to life and the Cessna began taxiing toward the runway, David caught a flicker of movement at the forest edge, a momentary shadow that might have been imagination or genuine threat. His body tensed, senses heightened to maximum alertness. Rachel noticed his reaction, following his gaze to the tree line. Something there. David watched for another moment before the plane's movement changed his angle of view. Maybe nothing. maybe just fatigue playing tricks. The uncertainty hung between them as the Cessna accelerated down the runway wheels, lifting from the gravel as they became airborne. Through the small window, David watched the airfield recede, the forest surrounding it becoming a textured carpet of green and shadow. If Richards had reached the perimeter, he was too late, the Cessna climbing steadily into cloud cover that would mask their departure. Yet David couldn't shake the feeling that their escape marked not an ending, but a temporary reprieve. Richards had invested too much sacrifice, too many resources, to simply abandon his pursuit. As the plane leveled off, heading northeast toward Idaho, Ethan finally relaxed against his father's side, the constant tension of the past days giving way to exhausted slumber. David brushed the hair from his son's forehead in a gesture of tenderness that contrasted sharply with the vigilance he maintained, eyes scanning the clouds around them for signs of pursuit. Across the narrow aisle, Rachel met his gaze with understanding beyond words. They had survived the immediate crisis, but the road ahead remained uncertain, a life in temporary exile, while the FBI dismantled Richard's network and neutralized the threat he represented. Yet in his son's peaceful face, David found something he had lost in the years since Sarah's death, a sense of purpose beyond survival, a connection to the future rather than the past. Whatever challenges awaited, they would face them together, a family forged in crisis but strengthened by the bonds that had brought them through. The Cessna flew onward, carrying them toward temporary sanctuary, while below the forests of Oregon kept their secrets, a cabin abandoned in haste, a hidden network partially exposed, and a wounded predator whose hunt had been interrupted but perhaps not ended.